The world is an analog place, whether it be temperature, pressure, flow rate, audio. Everything in the world is analog.
I call Jim a poet in circuitry.
Jim was, I think, a scientist. He was an inventor. He was artistic, and he was an engineer. And he had the rare ability to take all of those skills and integrate them together and make them easy to understand.
I can't tell you how many people use Jim as their sounding board for technical issues. And that's one of the great things that he would do. He'd always be available for you. No question was too stupid. And he would sit down, whether you were a senior guy or you're a junior guy right out of college, and he would slowly, methodically, and in a very helping way, help you figure out what the circuits were about and what was going on.
When Jim Williams came in, he surprised me for his first interview. He actually showed up in Bermuda shorts. And I thought, wow, this guy's either really confident or weird. He came to my office and pulled up a chair as close as he could get to the front of my desk, looked me in the eye, and proceeded to interview me for an hour.
Early on, Bob Dobkin, who was his boss, encouraged Jim to write articles as he worked on application circuits. And Jim became well known because his application notes were very detailed and very thorough, but very easy for the reader to understand.
Math can describe, 3.29, it can give you all those decimal points, but it won't tell you the real understanding of what's going on, and that's how he communicated, very intuitively, he'd have little expressions that you'd pick up from reading him over the years.
I never really noticed Jim Williams' celebrity status at Linear Technology until I went to a customer visit with him. The customer completely ignored me and just went straight to Jim and said, "Oh wow, I finally get to meet you," and shook his hand. And there was a little bit of gushing involved, and of course I was kind of going, "Oh, what's going on here?"
Jim had an app note years ago that was a page short, and the back page was blank. Bob Swanson saw the proof and said, "What's going on the back page?" Jim said, "Nothing, I finished." Bob said, "We're paying for that page, and it's not going to be blank." So he drew a cartoon, and it was a hit. Thereafter, all of his app notes had cartoons. Jim had a newborn son at the time in the early 90s, and Jim and his wife determined that Jim was the one who would take care of the baby at night. And Jim decided, what else do you do at night but hack circuits? Came up with the idea of baby bottles, denoting the complexity of the circuit. And a simple circuit would just get a couple baby bottles, and a complicated one would get a lot of baby bottles, signifying a feeding, a number of feedings. Customers still talk about that app note.
So my first impression of Jim Williams' desk was that I thought he was a mad scientist.
Jim would make his bench here at work as messy as possible to make it more difficult for other engineers to come by and grab equipment they would need for their measurements off of his bench.
He doesn't just pile up his circuit boards that he finishes. He assembles them, and he also places them that they kind of look like a mini city. There'll be like a bridge on top of two power supplies or something, and his board would sit on top in a slope.
He needed a part, it was there.
I would point investors to this maze of wires in Jim's office and say, that's analog design.
And the investors were really impressed. And they would walk away and think, boy, these guys are a bunch of gurus, and that must be some black magic. Just look at what it takes to be successful in analog.
Jim had a reputation that I don't know if it's good to encourage in the younger crowd of playing pranks.
One morning I walked into my lab and I noticed that the clock on the wall was running 5 minutes an hour slow.
Okay, we knew somebody was messing with it, so we fixed it. Then it started running backwards.
It was running at the correct speed, but it was running backwards.
And I went so far as to call up the manufacturer, and he said it's impossible for them to run backwards.
So I had the clock replaced. Then I built up a little circuit consisting of a battery, a micro switch, a 2-second time delay, and a flash bulb. You know, anybody tampering with the clock, of course, would have the flash bulb flash in their face. The next day, I went in to the lab, and I noticed that the clock wasn't hanging quite right. It was setting out on the bottom. So I carefully removed it, and this dummy hand grenade fell out. And there was a picture of a finger and a comment about, "This is the only picture you'll get from me. How stupid do you think I am?"
Then we called it quits.
It wasn't until years later that he finally admitted that it was him.
He did electronic art. He would look around at the junk stores for interesting looking parts, and he would use those parts to make some sculpture that told pressure or temperature.
And they were all working in working conditions. And he loved to make them.
It shows you the visual aesthetic that he had. That, you know, things, a Tektronix oscilloscope was beautiful just by looking inside and seeing other people's thoughtful contributions, and he kind of interpreted that as a language.
I can tell you, when Jim passed away, an engineer came to Jim's house and knocked at his door, and his wife answered, and his engineer said, "Is it true that Jim has died?" And yes. And he stood there and cried, and his wife didn't know who he was, but he knew who Jim was.
I've known Jim since '70s. While at Linear, I'd see him every day. I'd pass his desk, we'd talk about what's going on and calls he's got and what he's writing up. And he worked for me. Sometimes he got a little direction from me, sometimes he would make up his direction, but he was always somebody that I could talk to about some of the problems we were having here and different product ideas, and almost daily for 30 years here. And now that he's gone, I look at his empty desk and his empty office, and I miss him.
What is it?
Beauty. So I think analog is beauty.